Good morning. So we'll begin for the Dharma talk with the opening chant. The profound and wondrous Dharma is rarely encountered even 100 million kalpas. Having it to hear, accept and maintain, may I taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. So this morning we welcome back Onryu Mary Stairs. Thank you for being here, Mary. Mary is a Dharma sibling of Karun and I, and has talked at Stone Creek several times before. And just to give you a little history, and then Mary, you can fill in. Mary's Canadian. It's really important to know. And began her life in the Dharma at Gampo Abbey and studying in the Tibetan tradition. And then we all were together at Tassajara Zen Mountain Center for a number of years. So Mary has a blend of the Tibetan and Zen traditions in her practice life and history. And most recently, Mary's a resident at the San Francisco Zen Center's City Center. She has recently moved from being the head of practice to the head of the practice in the kitchen. So she is sharing her children's mind and her big mind and her grandparental mind from that vantage point delightfully. Thank you so much for sharing your Dharma with us this morning, Mary. And when you need to unmute yourself, Mary.
Okay, thank you very much. That was such a lovely introduction. Thank you. So thank you both for inviting me to speak today at Stone Creek. I don't know how many times I've spoken there. I don't think it's several, maybe a couple. But it certainly is the first time in this particular format. So this is an interesting change for all of us and for the people that are listening to these talks, certainly. I think that this format is forcing us all to work on how to feel connected in different ways. And I personally have enjoyed the study of the Lojong teachings throughout this period of shelter in place in a different way than I used to think of it. Just to give you a little tiny bit of history about my study of the teachings. In 1999, while I was living at Gampo Abbey, I met this teacher who changed my life. Her name was Trime Lamo, and she gave me the book Training the Mind. And this book, she just sort of dropped on my lap one day and suggested that it might be interesting to me. And at the time I thought, well, yeah, I'll read that. And so I read it, and then I think I put it aside for a while. She brought it up a number of times, but her way wasn't ever to do more than mention things over and over and over again. So she would keep sort of saying that it was important to her, and talked about the slogans, but it was very it was a different kind of teaching for me than what I had been exposed to in my life, I would say, through books. It sort of infused her life rather than it being something that she just talked about. So then I went to Tassajara, and the summer that I was Fuguten at Tassajara. In 2010, I was having a difficult time. The Fuguten is the person that takes all the information that's needed, like all of the cabbage that needs to be cut, all the carrots that need to be chopped, all of the preparation that needs to be done before the cooking happens. And they translate that request into actual usable goods. And they do that with sometimes a crew and sometimes volunteers. Sometimes you have people that show up for a couple of hours. Sometimes you have people that are there for 6 months. And that job is extremely social and extremely active. It was one of the first training jobs that I had where I started thinking in a different way. And I remember there was, at first, my frustration, which was extreme, was with me thinking if they would just do what I want them to do, my life will be easier and their lives will be easier. And I know Charlie was Tenzo, and I imagine he can relate to this really well. So this was the slogan that went in my mind at the beginning of that summer. If they would just do what I say to them, that everything will be better. And I would be fuming at the end of the day about the fact that I had said very clearly, okay, please just take these green beans, take the top off, take the end off, cut them in half, and do that over and over so you have 6 gallons. And then I would get them back and they'd be like French cut or something, because somebody had thought, well, this will be prettier, or this is sort of the way I enjoy it, or this is the way, this is better. So this is better. So I would end up with these green beans that were beautifully, beautifully cut in a French way, you know, diagonally, perfect size. Somebody really thought about this, but it wasn't what I wanted, and it wasn't what the guest cook wanted. And then I would get to go to the guest cook and say, well, sorry about those green beans, but these are, here you go, you know. And so I was dealing with extreme amounts of frustration. And then for whatever reason, I might have had a conversation with Dreame. She said something, if either it was an actual conversation or something in my brain that reminded me, and I had the book, so I started reading the book. And that reading of the book had me latch on to slogan number 26, which is don't ponder others. And that was the beginning of a change for me in terms of both my interest in the Lojong slogans and my experience in the kitchen that summer. Because I would say, please prepare these green beans. This is what I would like. They would come back in a completely different way. And I would say, okay, I'd go talk to the guest cook, and I wouldn't think about the causes and conditions that forced that person to do something that was outside of what I wanted. And also it allowed me to accept what the guest cook would say, which was, this isn't what I wanted. And I could say, I'm really sorry, but this is what I have. This is, please work with this thing. So that for me was this amazing change. It allowed for me not only to start relating to people in a different way, but also to relate in my mind in a different way. And I don't know, I remember writing that slogan out. I remember like putting it on the door of the cabin that I lived in. I remembered thinking about it. I remembered trying actively, when I would start getting frustrated, to to remember that slogan and think about the slogan rather than going down the story of my frustration. And so as I said, this allowed me to imagine that my mind was workable in a different way, to imagine that instead of thinking that my way was important, was allowing in this idea that actually it didn't matter that much, that I could make a request, something then would happen, and then the next thing would happen. And the follow through about why those things all happened wasn't important. That was really radical for me. I think that I have been trained to examine critically my actions and other people's actions, and to kind of assess a logic to them, to think of them as reasonable or not reasonable, to value that kind of logical consequence. And so instead of getting mixed up in that kind of thinking, I started, I think it's like cleaning up both the requests that I made to people and the subsequent activities that happened as a result of either things happening the way I requested or happening in different ways that I didn't request. And so that summer, I remember talking to Sarah about these slogans, and I remember talking to my sister, who was also a Buddhist, about these slogans, and starting to think more and more about how this mind training was slowly, I would say, kind of rewriting my approach to how I perceived myself. So today, what I'm thinking of is the slogan number 48, actually, which is train without bias in all areas. It is crucial always to do so pervasively and wholeheartedly. That's Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche's translation of that. So that's a Tibetan way of saying that slogan. And I was listening to Charlie's talk that he gave at Green Gulch on the 21st of June, earlier this morning, when I first woke up. And Charlie said over and over again a phrase from one of the Zen koans, which is throughout the body are hands and eyes. So he talked about that koan. And I would say that that's a Zen way of saying this phrase exactly. So the eyes take in, the hands give. The eyes take in, the hands give. And by thoroughly studying our actions with our eyes, with the information we receive, and by examining that, then the activity of the hands, the giving, the sending, that mechanism is this training all the time, training through the information that's coming into us, and then the activity that is springing from that information. And I think that this slogan for me is relevant to the time right now. It's relevant in the idea of, for me, white privilege. It's relevant in the idea of what's happening with this virus, because I think our brains try to categorize everything, and we try to make differences between, so what's relevant to me, what's relevant to other people, what do I need to pay attention, what is like okay for me, which is different from what's okay for other people. What do I know about white privilege? What do I want to know about white privilege? What do I want to know about the experience of less privileged people around the virus? What do I want to know? What do I don't? What are the things I don't want to know? What are the things that I can't take in? And this slogan number 48 is encouraging us to slowly and gently start working with every aspect of our lives and to examine those things to see what we're doing with that information, how we're handling that, how we're privileging that information. Can we accept that information? So the request, pervasively and wholeheartedly is looking at everything. Not today, not all at once so it's overwhelming, but over time, looking, searching, asking. And I think this inquiry starts allowing us to make sense of our world without the blinkers on that we were all conditioned to have. And one of the things that's happening in, I think, our milieu right now is we're starting to acknowledge that we have blind spots. And I think this is for me anyway, this is it's an unpleasant realization. And it's also something that practice has allowed me to kind of grapple with over the last 20 years that I've been practicing. That my conditioning is problematic. That my conditioning has by its very nature blind spots. And that it's only the first step to say, well, that was how I was raised. That was how I was educated. That was how my parents taught me. That's an important first step. And this is why I think this system of training, or this one in particular, because this is sort of what my mind has been doing lately, it says, you can't change this overnight. The request is to do this for years, years. And I came back to the original story. Yesterday I was thinking about it. I also had a conversation with Sarah. I was looking at the history again of the teachings, and one of the things that impressed me when I first started exploring the history of the Lojong teachings is it's not a story, the activity of Atisha, who was an incredibly privileged and also gifted scholar. So he was of royal birth. He had all of the privileges of that culture, absolutely. And he had this apparently amazing mind. So it's said that he became a monk at 29. He traveled throughout India. He was the abbot of a monastery at a young age. He had 150 teachers who he received teachings from. And by my understanding of that kind of time, people had a number of teachers, but teaching, actually working with 150 teachers is an amazing feat for somebody. And at a certain point, he heard of this compassion teaching. He heard of these, it was like a shadow of a conversation around these valuable teachings of compassion, that of all his teachers, he had never heard of this teaching before. So he got extremely curious. And he decided to travel from India to Sumatra, um, which was a journey of 13 months. There was a shipwreck. It wasn't one of those things where you like jump on a plane and in a couple of hours you arrive there. So this was a dangerous journey for a shadow of a teaching that he thought would be important, that he hadn't been exposed to of all of his other teachers. So he traveled to Indonesia. It was called Sumatra. And he started asking around about these teachings. And he through conversation, through journeying, through a pilgrimage, arrived at a I don't know if it was a monastery or it was a place where this person was teaching. And he started asking around to see, like, is this guy legitimate? What do you think of this guy? I've heard this thing. I traveled here. I'm interested in these teachings. What do you think? So he established some legitimacy, and then he went to Dharmakirti in Tibetan, Serlingpa, and said, I've heard of these teachings on compassion, and I'm interested in receiving them from you. And I don't know how that conversation went, but I do know that Dharmakirti agreed to pass these teachings on to him if he stayed for 12 years. And I, it's hard to know what to make of that. So you have somebody that's at the top of his game as far as teaching in India. I think he could have been teaching at any of the big universities there. And this teaching seemed important enough for him that he would say, because he did, okay, I'll stay for 12 years. And I'll receive these teachings from you, and then I'll go back to India. And he did indeed, according to the story, stay for 12 years. And then at the end of 12 years, he received his blessing from Dharmakirti, and he returned to India. And then after being requested many times to go to Tibet to teach, he then traveled to Tibet. And this was the basis of the teaching that he passed along to the Tibetans, not the other teachings that he received. And it's unclear from the reading I've done whether one of the sources said he would have been happy to teach other things, but the Tibetans at the time, for some reason, thought, no, these are the ones we want you to focus on. We want you to talk about these compassion teachings. This is, for the time, the most important teachings. Please devote your energies to these. So then he lived in Tibet, and he stayed there from 1042 to 10, or he was there, and he remained there for the rest of his life, I think 14 years. So for the balance of his life, these are the teachings he taught. And then again, they were secret teachings. They went through a protected lineage, and then about 100 years later, they were again picked up by another teacher, Chikao Yeshe Dorje, in about sometime in the middle of the 1100s. And he worked with a teacher also for 12 years in order to study these teachings, to stabilize them in his body and mind, and then to be able to transmit the teachings. And he was the one that systematized them into the 7 points and to these very brief slogans. The form that Atisha passed on was different than this form. So the system that I learned and that most Tibetans are familiar with are the system from Geshe Chikawa. But what I think about is that dedication and the time and the effort that the study went in. So again, this phrase, throughout the body are hands and eyes. When we first studying these teachings, I think we see with one eye and we work with one hand and one hand tied behind our back. We don't know our own limitations. We don't know even how our mind works often. We don't know the influences that bring us to this point. We don't know the prejudices we have, the privilege we have, the difficulty that our lives place on us, which either widen or limit our view to look a certain way. So these teachings invite us to train with all our hands and all our eyes. They invite us to open up our eyes, not just the two that we have, but the eyes throughout the hands and body. And to work with the hands, not just the two, but the hands that surround us that are throughout our body. And it is through that dedicated effort, I think, that allows us to start opening up to the pain of our lives, opening up to the conditioning, the limitations, the expansive possibility. Because before that point, I think we are unable to know our full potential, and we are limited by these binding opinions and karma that holds us in bondage. So by training without bias in all areas, we start being able to walk into our birthright, our humanity, our joyful mind. And I think that we live in a culture where we value fast food, we value quick learning, we value instant gratification. And this type of work that we're all engaged in now as conscious practitioners is not like fast food. It's slow food. It's slow, careful, gentle, loving. It's unmasking the eyes one at a time. It's learning to use the hands one at a time. And one of the phrases that lives with me right now is from the study that I've been doing around the slogans, and it's the phrase, "May my mind be kind." And I currently have this up on a Post-it in the cabinet in the bathroom, where I open it up in the morning and open it up at night. And I think of this phrase because I think this kindness allows me to start opening the eyes and allows me to start using the hands in a way that the direction I want to be moving. So I encourage you all to think about this as a mantra. May my mind be kind, and turn that and see if that is a useful way to view yourself, way to view your mind, way to view your relationships with people, way to start exposing yourself to yourself. So I think that's good for me talking, and I'm curious if people in the Sangha have questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. I have not studied these teachings, but I have been working with my own mind for many years, and in the nature of addictions, where I find that I don't want to do things that I want to do. So I'm curious if you could say your view of the facets of the mind that can lead us astray versus facets of the mind that are more enduring.
Thank you very much for the question. Our minds are made for one thing, and that's to generate thoughts. And they're very good at it. And I don't necessarily think that our mind discriminates between, oh, I'm only going to generate good thoughts, or healthy thoughts, or wholesome thoughts. I think the mind generates thoughts often without distinction. And I think it's the training I understand of all of us is to hear the mind and what it's saying to us. And then the next thing is to say, do I believe that thought? Do I want to do that thing? And with an unwholesome thought, because I think many people with addictions, this is their experience, is their mind is saying, oh, that would be a really good thing. Let's go out and do that thing. And your mind is doing what it does, which is it's saying, yeah, let's go out and do that thing. I want to do that thing. And then, so the job of training the mind is to ask the question, do I believe the thought? And I think that although that sounds like an incredibly easy thing to do, I think we're seduced by the thinking of our mind, and we often believe that the thoughts that the mind is generating are the way we should proceed, that's the next step. Oh, I'll do that thing. I'll go and do that thing. And so it's that open question rather than, oh, that's a bad thought, I'm not going to do that. I think the training that this model suggests is before you proceed, to have the space to think, do I believe that thought? Is that the thing to do? So it cuts up this chain of thinking into more digestible pieces. And I once heard that practice, sitting meditation, it allows us to take this stream of thinking like a paragraph without punctuation and break it up into sentences that make sense because you've added the punctuation. And that's what Zazen is. It's providing the punctuation in our thinking process. So I don't know if this, I mean, the question back to you is, does this seem to be in your recovery work? Can you relate to this idea of starting to explore the things that you want to do that you don't want to do? Do you explore them in a way that gives a little space and allows you to start making choices around what's wholesome, rather than kind of being led down this very worn path? Does that somewhat experience sound familiar to you in your work?
Yeah, well, that's what abstinence and sobriety from whatever addiction it is all about. You know, it could be counting to 10 or just, you know, I don't do these things. There does, and part of that, of course, is looking at the layers underneath, you know, the causal factors and the history and all that. And when you speak of training of the mind, I mean, part of how I think of my own recovery is I'm strengthening, say, my heart and my greater wisdom, as opposed to, you know, just sort of doing what my lower nature might want to do. So I'm curious, as far as the training, do you see sort of that you're training part of your mind or your heart, or?
Well, in Tibetan, interestingly enough, there's no distinction between heart, mind. It's the same word. So when you're training that part of you, they are completely not separate.
I see.
So I think even that's pretty fascinating, that in the West, we have these very distinct things, like you do this with your mind, and that activity is different from what you do with your heart. But in the language of Tibetan reflects the fact that they don't feel that that's a different thing that's happening. So I think even with that kind of language distinction, it shows kind of a gentleness that isn't so familiar to us in the West. I think we think of our heart as this soft, mushy thing that we shouldn't follow because it's dangerous. And our brain is really like that should be the driver, because that's where the intellect is, and that's where we can know what right and wrong is. And I think this exploration around the hands and eyes things is valuing both of those things as a part of the whole that have legitimacy, instead of having those as separate things. So I think, again, in the language of this system, even the word that you use, like strengthening, it's more like you're uncovering this goodness that exists within you, that has always existed within you, and starting to believe in it. So it's relaxing into how precious and wonderful you are, and believing that over and over, believing that. So it's very active. It's not that you don't have to do the work, and it's very this is your human nature.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I need to change my view, I'm sorry. Okay. Are you all trained to like put up your hand or to do the blue thing, or do people just start asking questions?
Usually, yeah, people just unmute themselves and ask.
Okay, great.
Or comment.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course you can. Hi, Holly.
Hi. I'm wondering, I really try to approach each day with kindness, and it can be really difficult, but especially in these days when I open the paper in the morning and I look at what's going on and the chaos that's going on in our country and the world, I find it hard to be kind towards some of what's going on. Can you help me with that?
Yeah, it's very difficult. I think somehow we have the idea that being kind should like be sweet and easy and natural. And I think this is very vigorous. You know, it means that what we have to do with our minds is to understand that every person lives in this world of samsara. Every person is suffering. Every person has causes and conditions that have brought them to where they are in their lives. And every being experiences pain. I might not understand. In fact, I know for certain that I do not understand the pain of the current president of the United States. I do not relate to that pain specifically, although I do not doubt that there is an extreme amount of suffering there. And so there, again, for me, it isn't the specifics that are so important. Those are important. I'm not dismissing how troubled the world is right now. However, I don't think that this particular training allows me to take him or other people outside of that human experience of suffering and put him somewhere else that makes it impossible to understand that there is suffering in that body. So it doesn't forgive the chaos. However, it allows me to practice knowing that there's chaos. Does that make sense, Holly, at all?
Yeah, it does.
Absolutely.
I find that really helpful. I try to. Yeah. Thank you very, very much.
You're welcome.
Hi, thank you for your talk.
Hi, Thomas.
Could you repeat the koan with the eyes and the hands? I couldn't quite catch the first word of it, or the first couple words.
The phrase that I repeated a few times is throughout the body are hand and eyes.
throughout. That was the word I couldn't catch. Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Mary?
Hi, Jude.
Hi, thank you so much. It was a wonderful talk. You talked about blind spots, which is a phrase I'm really familiar with from dream work. I've been doing dream work for about 30 years, and we talk about each other's blinds, that we're uniquely blind. That's the phrase we use. We're uniquely blind to our own blind spots. And that's why we work in dream work with a group, because it allows others to reflect back, oh, well, if this were my dream, that would mean X, Y, Z. And you can either take it as relevant or not. So I would love to hear your opinion or reflections or experience on the role of others in uncovering our blind spots, because it seems like, at least for me, it's the work of a lifetime to even see my own blind spots, let alone work through them, understand them, and try to perhaps behave differently. I just sort of feel like sometimes I'm just tripping over and continuing, endlessly repeating, what are my own blind spots? So I know I value the Sangha tremendously, and it's really hard in these days where we don't have person-to-person contact, or even a person's body can tell me, oh, there's something I'm not registering. Their body language is speaking to me, and I don't get that anymore. So anyway, I'd love to hear your take on the role of others in uncovering our own blind spots.
Well, I think others are invaluable, and in all sorts of different ways. Perfect strangers can help us see our blind spots, as can loved family or partners. I think that if we're sensitive, again, to keep with this idea of all our eyes throughout the body, we have these thousands of eyes that see things in different ways, and it's a matter of tuning into these different eyes to pick up different information. So having people in our lives to help us do the work is extremely important. And having said that, if we're not willing to do the work, it doesn't matter how much help other people give us. So it is this process of both. We need to be willing ourselves to start examining how we're moving through the world, and then to invite people in our lives to share their experience of us, and be willing to receive information from people that don't know us or that we don't know, to do the same. So this is it's a continual, as you say, work of a lifetime. This sensitivity to our 1,000 eyes doesn't happen by magic. It is this process of listening and willingness, I would say. And this is a different situation. We are doing this talk via Zoom, and it's very easy, I think, to say, well, I'm waiting till it goes back to how it was. This is an artificial situation, and I'm frustrated by it, and it's not workable. That's certainly one approach. It isn't necessarily the approach of practice. And the request of practice is what's happening now. So if this is the mechanism right now where I can have contact with my colleagues and with my loved ones, with family, then how do I best take advantage of this experience? How can I train without bias in this activity? Does that, it forces us to say, this is the situation, and how am I going to train now? And I think that that effort is significant, and also it's so beneficial, because it means that we're always working rather than, okay, I'm off the clock and I'm on the clock. Oh, now I'm off the clock. Oh, now I'm on the clock, you know? So it forces us to engage with our life every moment. And so I think that there is validity in my life right now. It looks different than it did 3 months ago. And yet there's still work that has to be done. Thank you very much, Jude.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, for your talk. Thank you so
Welcome.
much. It was very, very good, enlightening. I am just curious about why the teachings seemed so exclusive.
Could you say
Why-
more about your experience?
Yeah, I'm curious to know why these teachings that I think the person's name was Attica initially, why was it so difficult to access? Why was this made so difficult to access? That it had to be given to, you know, a special person, and then he had to go through this many years. And then I'm just wondering why this was not made more available.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Many years ago, I took a training with a Tibetan teacher named Khandro Rinpoche. She teaches in India, in France and Europe, and also has a Sangha in Virginia called Lotus Garden. And I went to, I think, 3 of her trainings on 3 successive years. And she said this thing that I won't forget, which is, oh, you Westerners are so funny. You come to the teaching and you say, could I receive the teaching? And I say to you, well, you were here last year and you received those teachings. Did you practice them over the year? And I would, and she said, and the Westerners usually say, no, I didn't practice them, but I want to receive the teaching you're giving this year. And she would say, okay. And then the next year, that same person would come back to the workshop again and say, please, Rinpoche, will you give me the teachings? And she would say, so I say, did you practice the teachings you received last year? And that person would say, well, no, I was too busy, but I want to receive the teachings this year. And so I think, I mean, for her, this was kind of painful and also delightful. People would come over and over and over again, like years of working with her, and she would give them precious teachings, and they would, like, it's like stamping a passport. They would take them home, put them on the shelf, and then come back the next year and want the next teaching. And I think that's why these teachings were so secret initially, is it takes years to understand how deeply compassion is in our system, and how almost fundamentally we reject it. And working with a teacher and having that teacher point this out, and having the ability to look at ourselves and to gently start opening up to these amazing things, I think it takes time and effort and honesty, and probably all sorts of words that I can't even think of. And so I think it was like, wow, these are so precious, these teachings. And not so many people seem to be able to dedicate the time or energy to understanding the teachings. So we're going to guard them closely. And then they started opening up and opening up. And by after, I would say, Geshe Chikawa in the middle part of the 1100s, they started being more widely known in Tibet and practiced by Tibetan practitioners. And then in the 1800s, there was a teacher who collected all of these teachings. He was a scholar, and he went around to all these various places and collected the teachings, not just these ones, but hundreds of various teachings, and put them in a book, a compendium. And I think that now if you type Lojong slogans on Google, you can read for weeks, you know. And you can take in this information as an intellectual experience. It's all available. However, taking information in as an intellectual experience is not practicing it. So that was a very long-winded answer to your question.
Thank you. No, I totally get that part. Totally get that part. I just didn't understand why they decided that to make it. I understand how long it takes to actually really live this way and really practice, but why not even start for those who might be able to do that? I guess that was my question. But perhaps, yeah, so why not? I guess maybe in their thinking, they had to really be there to train the person in the Lojong and not just leave it up to, you know, the public to do. So I do get that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for your
Thank
question.
you so much. Yes.
Watch, Mary. So we'll do the closing chant and then have time for announcements. And then those who would like to stay can go into small groups just for socializing. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are infinite. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is boundless. I vow to realize it.